Of your body has mainly two components. The one which is present in midline is called the central nervous system. The one which is present on periphery is called the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of your brain and the spinal cord. Now the functional unit of the nervous system is the neuron, and the neuron consists of a cell body and an axon. Now the cell body is called nucleus in the central nervous system, whereas the same cell body or aggregation of the cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system is called the ganglion. The axon in the central nervous system has different names like the tracts, like the pyramidal tract, the fasciculus, like the fasciculus gracilis, like the capsule, the internal capsule, and the lemniscus, like the medial and the lateral lemniscus. But the same axon in the peripheral nervous system is called the knobs. Now there are some exceptions or misnomers in this terminology. Now there is a term called the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia structure is present in the brain, and brain is the central nervous system. Basal ganglia is the aggregation of cell bodies, and we know that the cell bodies in the central nervous system is called the nucleus, but here we are calling it as the ganglia. So the correct name should be the basal nucleus. Likewise, there is a terminology called optic nerve. Now the optic nerve is the expansion of the diencephalon. The diencephalon is a part of the brain, which is the central nervous system. So this one, the optic nerve wire is used mainly for the peripheral nervous system, but we are using an expansion of the central nervous system and axon of the central nervous system as the nerve. The correct word should be optic tract. Now have a look at the development of the nervous system. On the dorsum of the baby, the most outermost layer is called the surface ectoderm. Just beneath the surface ectoderm is the mesoderm, and then comes the endoderm. Within the mesoderm, in the midline, the mesoderm condenses like a cord-like structure. This cord-like structure in the midline within the mesoderm is called the notochord. Now the surface ectoderm, which lies just above the notochord part, is stimulated and modified into a specialized layer called the neuroectoderm. Now this portion of the surface ectoderm invaginates into the mesoderm to form a groove-like structure. This groove fuse on both the edges to form a tube-like structure in the midline within the mesoderm. Now this tube detaches from the edges of surface ectoderm. The edges of the surface ectoderm from which the tube detaches also gives to another specialized type of cells called the neural crest cell and ectodermal placode. These two types of cell from both the edges detached lies parallel to the neural tube within the mesoderm. Now the rest part of the surface ectoderm after the detachment of the neural tube and the neural crest cell and the ectodermal placode fuse with each other. This single layer of the surface ectoderm in future forms the epidermis of the skin. Now this neural tube is open on both the ends. It's open cranially and it's open caudally. On 20th day of the intrauterine life, the fusion of the neural groove on both the edges to form the neural tube begins, and this one begins at the cervical region of the baby. Now this fusion of the neural group to form neural tube begins at the cervical region of the baby, and it progresses cranially and caudally. The fusion completes cranially to close the neural pore anteriorly or cranially on 25th day, and the fusion completes caudally to fuse the caudal neuropore on 3 days later on 28th day. Failure of fusion of the cranial neuropore along with the fusion of mesenchyme. The mesenchyme is the specialized mesodome, paraxial mesodome, which lies parallel and beside the notochord and the neural tube, which form the skull and the vertebral column. This mesenchyme form the vertebral column, the skull, and when the fusion fails in the neural tube, the fusion of the mesenchyme also fails to close the skull and the vertebral column. This fusion failure cranially causes the anencephaly, and caudally the fusion failure causes the rachis. Now this neural tube actually develops into the central nervous system, and the neural crest along with the ectodermal placode develops into the peripheral nervous system. Actually, the peripheral nervous system is mainly derived from the neural crest cell, but the nucleuses and the nerves like the fifth nerve and the vestibulocochlear nerve are actually derived from the ectodermal placode. Now, the neural tube develops into the central nervous system. That means the neural tube develops into the brain and the spinal cord. The upper part of the neural tube develops into the brain, and distal part develops into the spinal cord. The part of the neural tube which develops into the brain actually forms primarily 3 bulges, 3 swellings. The first swelling is for your forebrain, the second swelling is for your midbrain, and the third swelling is for your hindbrain. The first swelling is called the prosencephalon. The mid one is called the mesencephalon, and the hind one is called the rhombencephalon. Now the prosencephalon or forebrain bulge again forms 2 secondary bulges. The prosencephalon, the first one, again forms 2 secondary bulges. The one which is present cranially, the cranial most part, is called the telencephalon. This telencephalon develops into the cerebrum, basal ganglia, and the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the part of your brain which is responsible for your short-term memory. Now, prosencephalon again develops another secondary bulge called the diencephalon. The cranial most one was the telencephalon, and the caudal one was your diencephalon. Now the diencephalon gives the thalamus, epithalamus, subthalamus, hypothalamus, the optic nerve, retina, along with the iris, ciliary body, neurohypophysis, pineal gland. Now the mesencephalon doesn't give any secondary bulge. The rhombencephalon again gives 2 secondary bulges. The one which is present up or cranially is the metencephalon, and the one which is present caudally is the myelencephalon. The metencephalon gives the pons and the cerebellum. The myelencephalon gives the medulla oblongata. Now, the distal part of the neural tube, except these 3 bulges, 3 main bulges, form the spinal cord. Now, there is a tube Now, neural tube is a tube-like structure, and the cavity of the tube forms the ventricle. Now, look, the ventricle contains the fluid called the CSF. When the neural group first forms the neural tube, it encloses some part of the fluid which is present above the surface ectoderm while closing, and the fluid which is present above the surface ectoderm is the amniotic fluid within the amniotic cavity. So the neural tube first encloses the amniotic fluid as the CSF. Later on, the CSF is synthesized by the choroid plexus. Now the whole brain curves upon itself to form a C-like structure. The axis of this curvature is the thalamus. Now taking the thalamus as an axis, the whole brain curves upon itself. Along with the brain, the caudate nucleus, the corpus callosum, the fornix, all the structures also form a C-like structure. The two hemispheres are joined by some axonal fibers, and these axonal fibers are called the commissural fibers, which join the two areas of the two hemispheres. And the first commissural fiber to develop in your body is the anterior commissure. Next develops the corpus callosum and the fornix. Now let's discuss something about the Papez circuit. So what is the Papez circuit? The Papez circuit is the circuit of your memory. Now I told you that the part of your brain which is responsible for short-term memory is your hippocampus. Now hippocampus is a modified temporal lobe of your brain, and on this lobe the temporary memory is stored. From this lobe there is axonal fiber which goes up to the mammillary body. This axonal fiber is called the fornix. Now the fornix from the hippocampus goes to the mammillary body. Then the mammillary body is again connected to the hypothalamus. Again the hypothalamus is connected to the anterior portion of your thalamus. Then the anterior portion of your thalamus is further connected to the cingulate gyrus. And I told you this is a circuit, so circuit should be completed. So cingulate gyrus is again connected to the hippocampus. The cingulate gyrus is the cortical part, and you have to send the short-term memory which is present in the hippocampus to the cingulate gyrus, where it is stored as a long-term memory. Now have a look at the ventricles. So what are the ventricles actually? Now the neural tube has a cavity within it, and this cavity forms the ventricle. Okay. Now the part of the neural tube neural tube cavity which is present in the telencephalon forms the lateral ventricle. The two lateral ventricles are the part of the neural tube cavity which is present in telencephalon part. Now the part of the neural tube cavity which is present in the diencephalon part forms the third ventricle. Now the cavity which is present in the mesencephalon part or the midbrain part forms the aqueduct of Sylvius. Now the part of the cavity which is present in the rhombencephalon, the whole rhombencephalon part forms the fourth ventricle. Now the CSF is synthesized on the roof of the second ventricle, mainly the lateral ventricle, and it is synthesized from the choroid plexus. Now the CSF is synthesized from the choroid plexus and secreted into the lateral ventricle. Now the CSF goes into the lateral ventricle and it comes to the third ventricle through foramen of Monro. From the third ventricle it goes to the aqueduct of Sylvius. From the aqueduct of Sylvius, the CSF goes to the fourth ventricle. Now, your fourth ventricle is sandwiched between the cerebellum and the brainstem. The cerebellum is present on the roof of the fourth ventricle, and the floor is formed by the brainstem, mainly the low part of your pons and upper part of your medulla oblongata. Now, on the roof, there are three openings called the foramina. Two openings are present laterally. The two openings are present laterally, called foramen of Lusca. And there's an opening which is present medially or on midline. There's the opening, one opening present on midline called foramen of Magendie. L for L, laterally present Lusca, midline present Magendie. Now the CSF, which was coming from the lateral ventricle to the fourth ventricle, now leaks into the subarachnoid space through these three openings. Okay, now the CSF is present in subarachnoid space. From the subarachnoid space, the CSF goes to the great veins or the dural venous sinuses, subdural venous sinuses, through the arachnoid granulations. Now the veins and now the CSF is present or drained into the veins, great veins.